Presidential succession is a fancy way of saying who becomes president when the old president dies. And you'd think it's simple. You have a president and you have a vice president, and well, if the president dies, the vice president becomes president. And that's sort of the way it was intended. Oh, what happens if they both die? Well, then the Speaker of the House of Representatives becomes president. So if, God forbid, President Trump, and I'd say God forbid for any president, Democrat or Republican, I don't want people to die in office. I certainly don't want them harmed. But God forbid, President Trump and then Vice President Pence were suddenly dead. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House of Representatives, would be the President of the United States. If something happened to her, the President pro tem of the Senate would become the President of the United States. I do not know who that is right now. I should, but I don't. After the President pro tem of the Senate, and these are all elected officials, President's elected by the country, Vice President's elected by the country, Speaker of the House is elected by the House Representatives who are elected by each district in the country, President pro tem is elected by the Senate, who are elected by each state in the country. You see how it works. But then after that, after the President, the Vice President, the Secretary, the House Speaker of the House of Representatives, the President pro tem of the Senate, then you go to the department heads and cabinet. The fifth guy in succession is the Secretary of State. So if something happened to President Trump, Vice President Pence, Speaker Pelosi, whoever the President pro tem in the Senate is, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo would become the president. After that, it goes down a series of cabinet officers. And we have a succession that is now legislated down 50, 100, 150 people because of the Cold War and the possibility that in a sudden nuclear exchange, the entire federal government could be decapitated down to the Secretary, say, of Education or whatever. So who becomes president when the old president dies? In fact, so far anyway, we haven't had to go much deeper than the vice president. So in the early 1800s, James Knox Polk was an American general, a frontier general, who was elected president of the United States. And on Inauguration Day, which at that time was in March, he decided that he was going to make I think it was a 3 or 4 hour speech. 3 or 4 hours, because back in the day they made longer speeches. The problem was it was a freezing rainstorm. So President Polk makes this massive speech in the middle of a freezing rainstorm. He catches a cold, and a few weeks later he dies of it. Don't do that! If it's raining out, hold it inside, or make the speeches short and sweet. So even though he was the vice president and not somebody who agreed a lot with Polk, John Tyler becomes president of the United States because Tyler was Polk's running mate. Tyler was Southern, whereas Polk was Western. Tyler was a different fellow, but he becomes president when Polk dies because of the flu or the cold that he got when he was speaking out in the freezing rainstorm. The next succession was President Abraham Lincoln, first Republican president of the United States. His presidency is what sparks the Civil War. The prospect of a President Lincoln was enough to bring the militias of South Carolina to fire on the federal base at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, which causes the Civil War to begin. Well, Lincoln's presidency is defined by that same Civil War. He runs for re-election in 1864 and wins. And when the war, our bloodiest, finally comes to a conclusion in 1865, President Lincoln is assassinated within weeks of victory. His replacement is Vice President Andrew Johnson, who is a very, very different sort of fellow than Lincoln was. So Lincoln never really ruled in peacetime. And what Johnson did is he alienated everyone. And Johnson was the first president to be impeached. Andrew Johnson was impeached by Congress. And a lot of the bad stuff that happened after the Civil War is laid at the feet of John Wilkes Booth, the assassin who killed Lincoln, because instead of President Lincoln, a figure that had the stature to bring the country together and dominate Congress. You have this guy, Andrew Johnson, who is much different, not as strong, not as well respected, and ultimately impeached. William McKinley is elected in 1896, and in 1900 he presides over the Spanish-American War. An anarchist assassinates McKinley in 1901. His vice president is the young former Secretary of the Navy and Rough Rider, a fighter in the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt. McKinley was sort of a gray figure. Theodore Roosevelt is one of the most popular presidents in American history. I've got my problems with him, but Teddy Roosevelt is the kind of guy that progressives and conservatives like for different reasons. Roosevelt actually founds the Progressive Party of the United States later in 1912. Roosevelt is a liberal or a progressive Republican. And progressives like him because he created the national parks, because he passed a lot of environmental regulation, the first major federal environmental regulation, because again and again he sided with workers over owners in these massive strikes that were going on at the time, and because he believed in the federal government being a force for good in people's lives. Conservatives tend to like Teddy Roosevelt because he was strong. He believed, his famous saying is, walk softly but carry a big stick. He built the U.S. Navy into a powerful battleship force. He would use the American Marines and the American military overseas to fight for American interests. He stood up to the German Kaiser. He was a very activist and strong president who favored a strong military and a strong national foreign policy that was confronting evil, not cooperating with it for the sake of peace. So conservatives tend to like him, and progressives and liberals tend to like him. He would not have been president but for an assassin's bullet. Now we come to Woodrow Wilson. And I told you about him. Wilson is our president during the height of the progressive revolution in this country. In 1913, 14, 15, and 16, Wilson really changes the role of the federal government as regards everyday people's lives. He establishes a strong federal government capable of setting up a welfare state that involves itself in, for example, the quality of meat that people can sell and buy in grocery stores. Well, Wilson is also president at the time the United States gets involved in World War I. After World War I, Wilson comes back to the United States, having negotiated the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, which was a very difficult thing. It was designed to create a long-lasting peace after the end of World War I. But Wilson didn't bring a single Republican, and the Republicans dominated the U.S. Senate. Wilson was willing to argue with the Prime Minister of Britain, the President of France, the Prime Minister of Italy, and a bunch of other people, but he was not willing to argue with Republicans in his own delegation. As a consequence, he comes back with a Treaty of Versailles that includes American involvement in this organization that Wilson came up with called the League of Nations. And the implication is that America will take part in something called collective security, which is if a country invades another country, all the other countries of the world will gang up on that aggressor. That's collective security. And American wealth and military power were a big part of the selling point for the League and for collective security, both Wilson's ideas. But when Wilson comes back, the U.S. Senate says no. First of all, George Washington warned us against getting involved in any foreign entanglements in his famous farewell address. We're not going to disagree with George Washington. We don't want to be the world's policeman. We don't want to be involved in every dispute around the world. We don't want to sign this treaty. The Senate has to sign any treaty negotiated by the American government or the American president. And in this case, the Senate refuses. So Wilson's only recourse is to go around the country on a whistle-stop tour from train stop to train stop, traveling on a train, speaking. He's already at a state of nervous exhaustion. He has a stroke and collapses. He's still alive, but he's bedridden and he's incommunicado. What should have happened is his vice president should have taken over. But no. Edith Wilson, his wife, took over. She would be the go-between between everyone who had business with the President of the United States and this man who's basically barely able to keep his eyes open in a bed. And she'd go over and like whisper in his ear and then listen to his lips, and he might or might not make noise, but she would make the decision. We did have a female president in 1920, and her name was Edith Wilson, unelected. And they let this happen. The vice president and the cabinet secretaries all let this happen. That is not what should have happened. And that scared enough people to begin making more formal laws about the vice presidency. Not if the president dies, but what if the president is incapacitated in some way? Okay. Wilson's successor, the next president, not Wilson's successor, is President Warren G. Harding, who also dies suddenly in office. He's not assassinated. He has a health collapse, and he dies. So his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, becomes president. Now we go to the president who led the country, for better or worse, during the Great Depression and during World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the cousin of former President Teddy Roosevelt, a Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt, not a Republican like Teddy. He's the only president elected not only to 3 terms of office, but to 4 terms of office. And President Roosevelt, when he dies early in 1945, is succeeded by his vice president, Harry S. Truman. Now, we actually had a pretty close call with that. The vice president that Franklin Roosevelt ran with in 1940, Alben Barkley, was very, very, very far left socialist and friendly to the communist Soviet Union. Had he been kept as vice president into 1945, he would have become president at the beginning of the Cold War. And instead of standing up to the Soviets, it's quite likely the United States would have gone along with the Soviet takeover of vast regions of Europe and Asia. But a lot of people in 1944 who were Democrats were afraid of that very thing. They were Democrats, not communists. And they got Barkley out and they got centrist Harry Truman in. And Harry Truman is actually one of the most effective presidents in American history. So he becomes Roosevelt's successor. In 1963, John F. Kennedy, Democrat, is assassinated in October, and his successor, Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, becomes president, and he also, both very effective presidents in their way. The last time we had a succession was in 1974. President Richard Nixon, Republican, was elected in 68 and in 72. He was a very popular president in 72. He won 49 out of the 50 states. Massachusetts was the only state that voted for, not Hubert Humphrey, George McGovern, the Democrat candidate in 1972. But Nixon authorized the cover-up of a break-in to the Democrat National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. And there was evidence that he was involved in this cover-up. It's a third-rate burglary, but the president covering up a third-rate burglary is BAD bad. It's unconstitutional. It's illegal. So a series of investigations happened, and the president of the United States was about to be impeached, and it's very likely, had he been impeached, that the Senate would have removed him from office. So when it became crystal clear in 1974 that Nixon was going to be impeached, President Richard Nixon resigned and President Gerald R. Ford took over. Now, Ford had not been elected vice president. Ford was a guy who was appointed to replace the elected vice president, Spiro Agnew, who was involved in basically financial schemes. So Nixon-Agnew wins in 72. Agnew is forced to resign because of financial scandal. Ford is replaces Agnew. And then in 74, Nixon resigns, and Ford is the only president of the United States ever not to be elected in any way, shape, or form. So those are the cases where presidents were succeeded by their vice presidents.